Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello. I'll just wait for a few more people to join. Welcome to the Climate Hot Seat. I can see people joining now. You can write in the chat where you're joining us from as you're joining us now. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Hot Seat, a youth environmental hustings for Scotland. I'm Michaela Loach, your host for this evening, and I'm a climate justice activist, co-host of the Yikes podcast, writer and medical student based in Edinburgh. I use she, her pronouns. With me, I've got Anna, Col and Dylan, three wonderful climate activists who have been part of a group organising for this event. I also have the leaders of the five main Scottish political parties here. I'll introduce them in a minute. We have two British Sign Language interpreters, Lou and Robert, with us. So now we're just a month away from the Scottish Parliament elections on Thursday, the 6th of May. And we want to make sure that you have all the information that you need on who to vote for. This is the biggest issue of our generation. We put a call out for questions and received them on a range of topics, from the nature emergency to climate targets, food justice, and marine protection. We also received questions via our warm-up event last month, when young people spoke with environmental experts on the main key issues for this election. Thank you for all of those of you who submitted your questions. We've got 5 main environmental topics that we'll be covering tonight based on these questions. You in the audience can still ask questions. Just put your question in the chat box or the Q&A box. Please add your name, age, and where you're based in Scotland with your question. We'll try and answer as many as we can, but we might not be able to reach all of them. You can ask more questions on social media using the hashtag #ScotHotSeat. And of course, myself and the moderator panel will be asking follow-up questions if we feel the question isn't being answered properly. The chat here in Zoom will be moderated, and we do not tolerate any hate speech or bullying, so anyone engaging in this behaviour will be removed from the event. So let's get straight to our panel tonight. We have Anna Sarwar, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Douglas Ross, leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, Nicola Sturgeon, leader of the Scottish National Party, Patrick Harvey, governor of the Scottish Green Party, and I'll slow down a little bit just so I can let the BSL interpreters catch up, and Will Rennie, leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Okay, so let's get, also co-governor of the Scottish Green Party, sorry about that. Okay, let's get straight into the questions. Col is up first and is asking about the nature emergency.
Thanks, Michaela. I'm Col McHale. I'm 17. I'm from South Lanarkshire. I'm in my last year of school and I'm a social and climate justice activist. We live in a nature emergency, but let's explore what that means for a moment. Native woodland covers approximately 4% of overall land. More than half of native woods are choked by rhododendron and overgrazed. Scotland's peatlands cover more than 20% of the land area of Scotland, but approximately 70% of those peatlands are degraded to some degree. 70% of our land is used for agriculture, and yet, now that we have left the European Union, we lack a future agricultural policy direction. With this in mind, our first question comes from Josie, who's 24 and from Perth and Kinross. People say Scotland is beautiful, wild, but I walk through woodlands dying under deer pressure, look at barren glens full only of sheep and vast tracts of land managed exclusively for a minority who shoot birds for fun. I feel the life that is missing from my home and grieve for something I've never known, but I am filled with hope at the potential of restoring it. What policies will you bring in to achieve the land use change needed to tackle the nature and climate crisis? Anas, could we go to you first on that, please?
Thank you, Colin. Can I say a thank you to yourself, all your co-panelists, and Michaela as our fantastic chair for the very kind invitation to speak to you all today. And I should also start with an apology. I will need to duck off at 8:30 due to Ramadan opening, and my eldest son's first time he's doing the main fast this year. So I promised him his special favorite pizza today, so I'm gonna have to leave at 8:30. So a sincere apologies to everyone. I have to leave a bit early, and can also say a thank you for putting the climate emergency front and centre of YouthLink, Scotland's key work in terms of this election campaign. And it's really important that you hold all us politicians to account to recognise the need to address the climate emergency. You'll hear all of us today talk about the national recovery, and I think all of us, I hope, would agree that the climate recovery has to be front and centre of that green recovery as well. So specifically answering the question call around the use of land, when we publish our manifesto next week, we're going to be talking a lot more about how we get greater equity in land ownership, because there is a disparity in that across the country. How we have a conservation core which empowers young people in particular as part of our jobs guarantee scheme to get more young people out there active working in the environment and helping to educate, but also helping to drive change across different parts of our country. Also recognizing that we have lots of species within these woodlands who are going largely extinct because of inaction in those areas. How do we protect those species going forward? And how do we have a education being an absolutely key part of that in terms of young people being the drivers of educating us? Because I certainly know from my own kids how much more alive they are to the issues of the climate emergency and the nature emergency, the use of land. I think we've all got even greater appreciation of the land around us through this pandemic. How do we open that up in a way that helps promote health and well-being of our society? How do we open it up in a way that helps us protect the environment, nature, and also the wider climate? And how do we democratize the use of that land so there's greater access to people and not hoarding of land in individual companies or individuals across the country? And these are all big things that we want to be setting out in more detail when we publish our manifesto next week.
Thanks, Anas. And I think putting a green recovery front and centre is something that we can all get behind. Douglas Ross, what policies would you bring in to achieve the land use change needed to tackle the nature and climate crisis?
Well, thank you, Col, as well, and all the fellow young moderators, and Michaela, who will be keeping us all in order, and also to Rob and Lou, who I know will be trying to keep up with politicians who probably speak too fast and say too much. So I'll try and keep my pace slow. Sometimes coming from the north of Scotland, I know I speak a bit faster than others. But it is great that we've got this opportunity tonight to both listen to young people about the climate emergency, which we all know is the biggest challenge that we will be facing in the next few years and decades, and to hopefully give some reassurance to young people that all political parties see this as the #1 priority that we have to focus on going forward. In terms of the specific question, I want to go back to a number of the points you made. First of all, I understand how depressing it can sometimes look. When I travel up the A9 and I look out to wilderness and see a few sheep, but actually what some people don't always acknowledge is the hard work those sheep are doing for our climate and for the environment. Actually, by having them on the hills, they're sometimes the only things that can survive, but they also help the wider habitat to be maintained. The way they graze, the way they walk around, the way they carry species on them and through them is actually a really important part of our ecosystem and protecting those ecosystems. I agree with what Anna said about protecting species. 1 in 9 species in Scotland is now at threat of extinction. 1 in 9 here in Scotland is in threat of extinction in the next few years. So that's why a couple of weeks ago, I launched the Scottish Conservative plans to bring forward a nature bill, a dedicated nature bill in the next Parliament to protect those species that are under threat. We've also outlined how we would increase tree planting across Scotland, and I will give credit to the Scottish Government. They have done good work here in Scotland, but also at a UK level. We have seen tree planting being prioritised, but I think we can go further. We want to see a reduction of the amount of peat that's extracted to go into compost. So these are all plans that we put forward in a dedicated nature bill, which would hopefully seek to address some of the concerns you've raised, Col. But I would say in other areas, actually a few sheep on the hillside are also doing a really good job as well.
Thank you very much. I mean, coming from South Lanarkshire, yes, we see a lot of sheep as well. No, I agree. Nicola Sturgeon, in your manifesto that you released the other day, you proposed a new land reform bill. And with this in mind, what policies would the SNP bring in to achieve the land use change necessary to tackle the climate crisis?
Thanks very much, Colin. Thanks to all of you for giving us the opportunity tonight. I think we're all looking forward to the debate that lies ahead over the next couple of hours. You'll hear all of us, and I think we all mean it, and we're all very sincere about the climate emergency and tackling that being the top priority. But there's no doubt that young people have got a key role to play in making sure we live up to those words. And, you know, I think tonight's discussion is an important part of that ahead of the election. I also think it's really important, and I think it's really good that we started with a question on the nature emergency, because it's just as urgent as the climate emergency, and we've got to see it in that way. Land is our biggest asset, or one of our biggest assets as a country. Our landscapes are one of our biggest assets, and we've got to do more to diversify the ownership of that. And to come straight to your question, we've had a lot of land reform in Scotland over the past number of years, allowing more land to have ways of going into community ownership, but there's a long way still to go there. And so the land reform bill that we're talking about is about continuing that journey. I want to see much more of our land in community ownership, much more of our land out of the hands of big enterprise, and therefore productive use in a positive way. I think we've got to protect more of our land. One of the things we've said in our manifesto is we want to see about 30% of our land nature protected, which is really important. We've got big commitments around tree planting. Already about 80% of trees planted in the UK are planted in Scotland, but we need to have more native species planted as well. We want to see tree planting increase by about 25%. We've set out big plans backed by a lot of investment for peatland restoration, about 250,000 hectares over the next few years we want to see restored. So I think all of that is vitally important, and you all need to keep us to the commitments that you'll hear all of us make this evening.
Thank you, Nicola. I think community ownership of land, I think if we can achieve that, there's so much we can do. Willie Rennie, could we go to you on that now, please? I know that you talked about expanding the Scottish Land Fund as the Liberal Democrats released their manifesto. So what policies would you like to see brought in to achieve?
Again, just to reiterate what the others have said about our appreciation for this evening, it's quite phenomenal. You're getting so many people engaged in this important discussion, and it does help to nudge us politicians along to do bolder action. So thank you for organising this evening. I don't tell many people about this, but I was supposed to be a nature reserve manager instead of a politician. So I have got an affection for diversity, biodiversity in particular, and I suppose I look at the environment in a slightly different way. There's one thing from the lockdown that's become apparent. When we weren't cutting the grass in parks, and now councils are looking at making sure that we continue not to cut the grass in many of the public spaces in order to get away from the Victorian standards of public space maintenance and to allow a greater diversity in and around our communities. That's one small way that the pandemic, I think, has changed the way that we're looking at the environment. There's a bit of pressure back from some members of the public who like the old standards, but I think we need to try and encourage the growth of verges and hedges, but also in the public spaces as well. But what we do need to make sure is that we set legally binding nature recovery targets, and that holds us to account for delivering those. We need, I think, 36 million new trees planted, but crucially half of those need to be native woodlands in order to improve that diversity as well. Then we've got an awful lot of public land owned by Scottish Water, by the Crown Estate, by other public bodies, quite large tracts of land. And we want to make sure that those tracts of land are devoted towards rewilding where it's appropriate to do so. So the public sector is making a big contribution towards that. There's an important role for licensing in terms of grouse moors, in terms of muir burn, to make sure that the state is having an influence over how the land is being managed as well. So all of those things I think will help to improve the diversity of the land. But the final commitment is around about national parks, because I think we need more national parks, in particular down in Galloway, where there's a big public demand to have one. And I think that again will add to the momentum towards rewilding in public areas. So some innovative projects, some of them are quite controversial up in the Highlands. And we have to understand that some of the pressures on these things rub up against sometimes local economic interests. And we need to work hard to make sure that the nature emergency becomes a priority in all of these things. But yes, we're absolutely committed to making this happen. Sometimes it's challenging, but that's why even more so you need to hold us to account to make these things happen.
Thanks, Willie. And it's nice to hear consensus on the issue of land ownership. Patrick, can we go to you now? I know that I mentioned peat bogs in my introduction. I know the Scottish Greens have talked about banning the burning of peatlands in your manifesto. So what policies would you like to bring in to address the land use change needs to tackle the climate crisis?
Thanks very much, Cole. Obviously, I have to be the fifth person to say thank you very much for organising the event. Thank you for the invitation. Really encouraging, I think, as well that you've begun on the nature emergency. And yes, there are elements of consensus. I think we can go further on banning the burning of peat. I think we can go further, as Willie says, on rewilding public land. There are commitments on that in our manifesto. And as Nicola said, expanding forestry. You know, Scotland has less than a fifth of its land covered by forestry. Even getting up to the European average would mean doubling that, getting to 40%. And yes, the majority of that should be native woodlands. But there are also areas where we won't have consensus on this. I don't think there should be a role for licensing of grouse moors, because I don't think there should be grouse moors. I don't think we should have whole swathes of our landscape ecologically degraded so that rich people can come and shoot stuff for fun. Even if I didn't have an ethical concern about rich people shooting stuff for fun, you know, if it was at least a healthy landscape, then maybe you could live with it. But it's a degraded landscape, and the industry that pursues this has resisted protection for species like Scotland's mountain hare. We've just recently in the last Parliament won protection for the mountain hare, which was being culled in extraordinary numbers. Look, if we are serious about this, we have to acknowledge that humanity has been and is still perpetrating a war against nature. And the only way to win is to surrender and give land back to nature. So, you know, the scale of a change that is required here is extraordinary. The last thing I want to say on this is that the protections for our land and for the natural diversity of our land need to be more than just on paper. And, you know, it's not so very long ago that a piece of land with the highest possible level of legal protection at the Menny Estate in Aberdeenshire was destroyed. The ecologically unique aspects of that land were destroyed because Donald Trump turned up saying he was going to invest a lot of money and said, give me what I want or I walk away. And the Scottish government gave him what he wanted, turning over the planning system in the process, taking power away from the local level where the local council's planning committee had said no. So those protections need to be more than just on paper. It should not be legally possible for, you know, someone with money to turn up and say, you know, the jobs that I'm promising, whether they materialize in the end or not, are more important than the protection of our natural landscape, because once it's gone, it takes a very, very long time for it to recover. That's what we have to begin now, is the recovery from a long, drawn-out war against nature, which we now have to surrender.
Thank you, Patrick. And I agree that tackling the nature emergency definitely means tackling the vested interests that come with it. The next question, if we move on now, is on marine protection. I'm sorry, my phone keeps buzzing, it is on silent. There's been lots of attention for the new Netflix documentary Seaspiracy, which specifically mentions Scottish fishing. Scotland's seas are one of our greatest assets and cover an area 6 times larger than the land. I need to slow down, don't I, for the interpreter? Sorry about that. The sea has played an important role in forming Scotland's heritage and indeed our cultural identity. The question comes from Caitlin, who's 20 and from East Ayrshire. In December, 4 new MPAs, which are marine protected areas, were designated in Scottish waters. This takes the total MPA protection of our waters to 37%. However, still only 1 no-take zone remains in Scotland at Lamlash Bay, and this inshore limit is yet to be reinstated, preventing damaging bottom trawling and dredging of the seabed. How will your party ensure that our seas and the Scottish marine environment are highly protected? Douglas, could we go to you on that, please?
Thanks, Col. And again, maybe not as recent as the Netflix series that you were speaking about, but I think Blue Planet, a couple of years ago, that series on BBC One really made a big difference. I certainly noticed a real uptick in the number of particularly young people, but people across my constituency here in Murray and across the country, contacting politicians after that series to just say how important it is that we do everything we can to protect the marine environment. So again, going back to the Nature Bill, which I announced a couple of weeks ago that we would bring forward, one of the areas we specifically highlighted in there was to have a review of marine protected areas with a view of expanding the extent to which they can operate, but also suggesting a pilot to introduce highly protected marine areas to go further than we've gone before. So I think we'll hear a lot tonight of good work that's been done so far, but we've got to go even further if we're going to tackle the major issues in front of us. So a suggestion, as I say, in our Nature Bill proposals would be to have a highly protected marine areas. And I think that's something that we could all look at very positively.
Thanks, Douglas. Patrick, could we go to you? I know that you've talked about excluding dredging and trawling in your manifesto.
Yes, and also the concept of highly protected areas. You know, we would like to see a third of Scotland's seas protected, and at least a third of that with this highly protected status, which means you're not having fishing happening there at all. And again, we need to recognise the long-term damage that's been done, not just decade after decade, but generation after generation. Our seas are greatly depleted from the rich, ecologically diverse places that they were. And it's so critical to the climate emergency, because ecologically rich, healthy landscapes on land and ecologically rich environment in the marine environment are critical to capturing carbon as well. We'd like to see a marine environment levy. So people might be familiar with the idea of taxing land use, so that, you know, if you make a profit from the way that land is being used, you have to pay something back to the public purse. We'd like to see a marine environment levy, so that all the businesses that extract profit from the seas, whether that's around fishing, whether it's oil and gas operations for as long as they last, and I hope that's not very long, whether it's aquaculture, offshore wind, if you're extracting profit from the marine environment, you should be paying back so that there's resources to invest in protecting it. There does need to be a much wider range of protections for the marine environment. And once again, we have to challenge the financial vested interests, which, you know, let's remember, when people talk about the fishing communities in Scotland, the communities themselves are not the ones in control of the industry. A very small number of big businesses are in control of the industry and have the majority of the right to fish in Scotland's waters. So if we want to support the coastal communities, it again means taking power away from those who've been making a profit from the destructive approach that we've seen in the past. The last thing to say, and it also requires some change in cultural perceptions about the availability of seafood. You know, there are sustainable sources of seafood. There are sustainable sources of other marine products like kelp, for example. But if we just mass harvest any of these marine resources, we will do lasting damage. That's what we've been doing, and it has to end.
Thank you, Patrick. Anas, how will the Labour Party look to protect our seas?
Thanks, Col. And again, it's a really serious issue, and we talk about the wider climate recovery. We talk about the nature emergency. We also have a marine environment emergency as well. And I think the way we do it is, first of all, recognising the importance of those landscapes and our coastal areas across Scotland. I think quite often this is a trap, and this is a self-criticism as well as a wider criticism, is we quite often, I think, get caught up in the central belt part of how we think about these things, when we actually need to think about impacts on communities right across the whole of Scotland. And actually, when we think about a national recovery, when we think about a climate recovery, we have to think about that recovery across all parts. So it's urban, rural, coastal, island communities alongside that as well. I think we do need to be bolder around marine protected areas. I think we have got to recognise the troubles that we see in our waters and our seas. At the same time, I think we've also got to recognise the challenges on the industry. And I think we need to be much more proactive and interventionist in terms of how we work with industry, partly around transitioning to alternative forms of employment, but also those individual communities. Because I think Patrick's right around big business, but actually the impact it has on the wider community is one that is has to be recognised. And then the other part is actually putting responsibility on business as well. If people are making profit from the seas, they also have a responsibility to protect our seas. And I'd like to see us being much more interventionist as a government in Scotland around, if you are going to get support for the industry, if you are going to get support for individual businesses and also for employees, then how you have a climate recovery front and centre of in any conditions on receiving any kind of public support or subsidy has to be at the heart of that. And I think we've got to look at that much more in the round so we can encourage good business, and good business also meaning protecting the climate, whether that be around carbon reduction, but also around the marine environment as well.
Thanks, Anas. And I think you're right about the central belt approach. Sometimes we are maybe too central belt centric, if you like. Welly, can we come to you? I know the Lib Dems has talked about starting a marine recovery plan, for example. So how would you guys protect our seas going forward?
You take the first words out of my mouth. That's certainly what we're planning to do. I think there's we're also in favour of the highly protected zones, the special protected zones, to expand them into that specialist character, that specialist zone as well, to make sure that we're enhancing the marine protected areas. Plastics are playing an important role. There are billions of what they call these little lentil-sized plastics, which has come from the industry, and they're around the coast of Scotland, billions of them everywhere. And we need tighter regulation in the plastics industry to make sure that they're not leaking into the oceans. And just now we've got a voluntary code of conduct with the industry, and I think we need to put that into legislation. That needs to change. Secondly, we need to make sure that we're doing proper research into the carbon capture capabilities of our seabeds, so that we're able to follow through with that best practice into the industry. Thirdly, we need to work in partnership with the fishermen and the fisherwomen to make sure that, because they know the seabeds often the best. I've got some of them in my constituency in Pitt and Weem, and they know their seabeds the best, and they know how best to make sure they're sustainable for the longer term. So we need to work together with them and the scientists to make sure we're driving that forward so we can have sustainable fishing for the longer term. And that also applies with the seaweed harvesting as well. That needs to be done in a sustainable way, unlike some of the other proposals that were coming forward recently. So all of those things, I think, are part of the package. There are some great charities that have been set up, including Fishing for Waste, which actually involves the fishing industry to get the plastics back out of the sea as well. So all of these good initiatives are really focusing on trying to improve the natural environment. We've got a big challenge ahead of us with the nature emergency having to do with the seas. Just because we can't see it every single minute doesn't mean there's no damage being done, and that's why we need to work extra hard to make sure we work in partnership to make this change.
Thanks, Willie. And your point about plastics is a good one, and it's one that we'll return to later. Nicola, can we come to you now? How will the SNP protect our seas?
Well, I think we should do two things. I think we should reflect on what we're already doing, which is not insignificant, but also be prepared to raise our ambition and be bolder. Our deep sea waters are home to so many important but threatened species and habitats. You know, coral gardens, deep sea sharks. The importance of protecting all of that is can't be overstated. The most recent MPA of the West of Scotland, which was designated just towards the end of last year, is the biggest MPA in Europe, and it is providing greater protection to some of Scotland's deepest waters, and is really important. It also takes Scotland past the global target of having more than 30% of our seas protected in that way. But I don't think we should see that as far as we go. I would highlight three additional things, which are not the only things, but I think just to to mention them. I would absolutely agree with Willie. I won't labour this point if we're coming back to it later on, but the importance of tackling plastics. We've got to stop polluting our oceans, and that means changing so many aspects of our day-to-day lives and what we use and how we use it, and plastics is a big part of that. I think it is really important that we understand this more, and the importance of research, I think, should be underlined, as well as a fantastic marine research centre at St Andrews University, and we need to do more of that. And then the last point, which others have made, is partnership with the fishing industry. The Fishing for Waste project is a good one, bringing plastics out of the sea. But I think we've got to understand that it is in the interest of our fishing industry for our seas to be sustainable and for us not to be damaging our oceans in that way. So I think we need to do much more to challenge, absolutely, but also to work with those who work on our seas. So I think we should be prepared to go further, but I think we should give ourselves some credit as well in terms of the work that is already being done in Scotland.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you all. I'll hand back to Michaela now and we'll move on.
Thank you, Carl and leaders. And remember, everyone who's watching, you can add your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box. If you feel like a question isn't being answered very well, you can use the chat box and say that. And please do engage with what we're saying, and also engage on social media using the hashtag #ScotHotSeat. If you're watching from home and you'll be 16 or over on the 6th of May 2021, you can vote in this upcoming election. You just need to be registered to vote, but you still have some time to do that. Go to gov.uk/register-to-vote for more information to register online, and you have until Monday to do that. And the next topic is Youth Voice, which is a great and important topic. And Anna will be speaking about that and asking those questions.
Thanks, Michaela. This is a really important topic for us, especially considering the recent passing of children's rights into Scots law. This means that amongst lots of other rights, children and young people have the right to be heard on issues that are important to them and the right to the best possible health, including a clean environment. It is really important that those, like youth workers, who support many of us young people to have our voices heard, continue to have politician support, especially throughout the climate crisis, which our generation will have to deal with. Like me, lots of other young people watching will not yet be old enough to vote in this election, yet we are taking action because we know that the climate crisis is an issue that will affect all of our lives. The first question for the Youth Voice topic comes from Jack, 18, from Perth and Kinross. Young people across Scotland and the world have become more aware of politics, climate justice, and the climate crisis, and we are more eager than ever to have our voices heard and listened to. How will you ensure that any engagement that you have with young people is frequent, meaningful, and leads to action? If you would like to start, Patrick.
Thanks very much. I mean, yeah, just to reflect on this for a minute, the youth climate movement, I think, is one of the few things that gives me real hope. Looking at the world, the state of our environment, the state of our economy, the state of our politics around the world, it can be very easy to lose hope. And I sometimes say hope is hard work, but it's necessary work. You have to work hard at being hopeful, because the alternative is to give up. I've been really privileged to be invited to speak at a number of the youth climate strike demos. And it's an extraordinary atmosphere, because I know how much my generation owes you an apology, a deep apology, because your generation has a right to feel angry and to feel impatient with the failures that my generation and those that came before. The last one that I spoke at just before the lockdown, actually, I think it was maybe a month before the lockdown. It was kind of funny, because I had the privilege of inviting my mum up to speak after me. Now, my mum was a Green activist decades ago, way before there was any chance of getting Greens elected to anything. And the point I was trying to make was that if the world had listened to the Green movement back in the late 70s, the early 80s, when the alarm bells were already sounding, the change that we have to go through would have been easy. It would have been slow and gradual and would have been managed more easily. The only reason we're using language like climate emergency now is that the world didn't listen to my mum's generation of green activists and continued on a business as usual path. So, you know, I don't want to, I think it would sound arrogant to say, you know, I'm going to listen to young people and I want to be inspired, yes, but I want you to embarrass me and my generation at how we have failed you. And I struggle to put into words how deep that apology needs to run. I do know that the Scottish Young Greens, for example, are about to run their first Climate Citizens Assembly. They're, you know, I hope going to be I hope that's the kind of conversation that you and many of the people in the audience are going to want to engage in. But yeah, I think yeah, I don't really know how to end this answer other than that, you know, sooner or later my generation will leave the stage and yours will take over, and you're going to have a harder job because we failed you. And yeah, I don't think I can end it any other way than that.
Thanks, Patrick. Douglas, if you want to talk about engagement with young people.
Thanks, Anna. And first of all, while you may not be able to vote in this election, you will in the next one. You know, so I think it's absolutely wrong for any politician to say to younger people, and I know no one on this stage does, that, well, if you don't have a vote in this election, you don't have a voice. You absolutely do, and you're articulating it today, and this is the method to do that. You as a group, as an organisation, have got the leaders of the 5 main political parties in Scotland together for 2 hours during a really important election campaign to listen to you, to respond to you, and to act. And I think, you know, the 2 words you said there in the question were frequent and meaningful, because there is no point us frequently meeting with you if nothing changes, if nothing happens. So there is a cast iron commitment from me to say, sorry, I'm reading a chat there from Tom. So I'll just read Tom's point about we can't wait until the next election. And that's kind of the point I was going to go on to. There is a cast iron commitment from me to continue these discussions out with election periods, because it's important from the 6th of May that the 129 MSPs elected to Holyrood don't just think that's them elected for 5 years and they can stop engaging, stop speaking, and stop having that meaningful impact with young people on this issue. I agree with Patrick that the world right now is in a poorer place than it was when I was younger, when he was younger. And for me, Anas has spoken about his own children. I've got a 2-year-old, and I always think, or I was thinking when this question was being asked, apart from snack, which my son says a lot, the second most popular word he has is outside. He just loves being outside in the outdoors. And I worry, what are the outdoors going to be like in a few years' time, or when it's time for his son and my grandchildren to go outdoors? So we have a huge responsibility now to improve things, to get on top of this issue, but also to listen to the concerns you have, because you are at the coalface. You are the young people who are going to steer our politics over the next few years and the next few decades. And only by having, and again, go back to those 2 words, frequent and meaningful engagement with you all, will you keep us in check. Because it would be too easy for us to think, well, we've ticked a box and we move on, and we simply cannot do that. So I hope by the time at the next election, when you're old enough to vote, Anna, you do feel that all of the politicians on this panel tonight, all of the parties represented, have continued to engage with young people, listen to young people, respond to your concerns, because we also don't have all the answers. It would be foolish for any political leader right now to say we know the best way to tackle climate change. In fact, some of the best ideas will be from the more than 270 young people in this audience. And the final thing I wanted to say, I think it was in our pre-discussion before we went live, that you've been planning this event since September. And I think it's really bad that you've had to wait that long to engage with political leaders from the main parties. So again, it goes back to Tom's point that he put in chat, it really shouldn't just be at election time. You feel like you can get the leaders of the political parties round a table and discuss these things with you. Let's do it far more frequently, and then you can hold us to account for what we need to do to hopefully pass on the environment, the climate in a better stage and a better way than it is right now.
Thanks, Douglas. You made the good point about trying to not just have all this engagement at election time. How would you propose you did it in other times of the year when it's not around the election?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of virtual meetings. So it's one of the few positives of this pandemic is it's actually really easy to get people around the table. We've seen it again tonight. We're all in different parts of Scotland. I saw people from the northeast in Aberdeenshire and the central belt just when people were saying where they're from. So now it's even easier than ever before. So I'd love to do a lot more of these. And then when we can get back to face-to-face meetings, it may be the right thing to do, or we will continue to meet virtually, because for a couple of hours each evening on a Friday, we can sit down at our computer and have this discussion. So absolutely that commitment to greater engagement is there from me.
Okay, thank you. Nicola, if you would like to answer about engagement with young people again, please.
So I could sit here and tell you the things that I want to do to try to better engage young people. You know, our manifesto talked about establishing a citizens' assembly on climate for the under 16s, similar to the climate assembly that we've had running over recent months. I've, met myself with climate strikers before the COVID pandemic struck. It's not been as easy to do it since then. But actually, I think this question is the wrong way around, to be honest. I don't think it should be about politicians deciding how they're going to engage with young people or how they're going to listen to young people. As young people, you shouldn't give us the choice. You should be absolutely banging down our doors if you don't think we're listening, if you don't think we're engaging, and more importantly, if you don't think we're taking the action that we have to be taken. And that's what I think is so hopeful about the climate youth movement, the climate strikes, is that young people have made clear they're not prepared to not be heard, and they're not prepared for politicians just to sort of drag their heels any longer. I think Patrick's right. I think your generation should be fizzing mad with my generation and those that have come before. We've let you down. We have abused the planet for too long, and we now have left you in a position where it's a race against time to sort that. And as long as my generation's still in the positions of power, we should not be let off the hook. And if that is rough and tough, and if that means kicking us out, that's what you should do. We need to get more young people and more people with that passion for climate justice into frontline politics as well, into Parliament, so that it's not about you lobbying people like us to make the decisions. You're in there being the decision makers yourself. So it's a great question, but I actually think we need to turn it on its head. It should no longer be about people like me sitting here saying, well, I might try to listen or engage better with young people. The time for that is past. We have to absolutely be held to account.
Thank you. Willie, if you want to answer that.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Nicola said. I think it is, you should be angry, you should be frustrated, and you should tell us, and don't hold back. Most other people don't hold back, so I don't see why you should hold back. It should be direct, blunt. You should be offering solutions. You should be telling us how you want to do things differently. What's quite encouraging in recent years was that we used to have quite a lot of difficulty in getting young people to vote in previous elections. There was a kind of I'm not going to bother. That's changed, and that's a good thing. And it's partly through the climate emergency and all these issues that people are actually thinking it's worthwhile using the political system to get the change that they want. And that's encouraging. There's lots of different mechanisms that Nicola's highlighted, and that's right. My door's always open. I have had numerous meetings with lots of different constituents and different age groups about these kind of things. And so you should just ask, if you feel intimidated about speaking in a big group, come and ask for a one-to-one. We can always find ways of making time to listen and hear. And if it's just dropping us a note, an authentic handwritten note sometimes actually counts for much more than any standard generic petitions or whatever. It shows us that you mean it, that you believe it, then it's worth it. You've made the effort to do that. But the final thing is that your role in influencing the rest of the population is important too. And they need to be banging on our doors in the same way as you're banging on our doors. So speaking to families and friends and neighbours and telling them what you think about this and what they should be doing to lobby us. This is a very processy type question, but it is what politics is about. And that's why I would encourage you just to tell us what you think and get others to tell us what you think, because that's the way that politics works and that's the way we get change.
Thanks, Willie. If we move over to you now, Anas.
Thanks, Anna. I'm not going to repeat what anyone else has said, but I just want to echo, Patrick used the word impatient. Nicola rightly used the word fizzing. Willie used the word angry. And actually, I want to widen it out. I actually don't think that's young people just in terms of the climate emergency. I think there are so many issues that young people are way more impatient, frustrated, angry with politics in the general. And Patrick touched upon this point about how we conduct our politics, how we do our politics, how our politics then is implemented. And this is not me making I'm not trying to use this as a way of criticizing one political party. I'm going to criticize the entire system on this. And actually, I think the last year has probably emphasized some of that in a really harder and starker sense. One around the climate emergency, but also I think around prejudice and hate, where there are young people who are not going to be anywhere near as patient as my generation or my parents' generation or my grandparents' generation were on all of these things. And they're going to be less forgiving of it as well. And I think you can already see actually from the chat function that frustration is being reflected in people losing hope in politics, people losing hope in the power of politics, and people losing hope that actually politicians can make decisions to actually change people's lives as a result. So I would say don't, as others have said, don't wait to be asked, actually push ahead. I support all the mechanisms that we talked about, citizens' assemblies. I support all about saying, chat our doors, talk to us and all the rest of it. Fundamentally, the challenge comes is we've got to turn that talk, all of us collectively, into actual real action. And there are going to be certain things that we've got to make sure we're pushing that go beyond what looks like us having our own fights amongst ourselves. That often too happens. Climate emergency, inequality, prejudice, all of that has to go beyond all of that. So how do we turn that rage and anger into meaningful action? I think is the challenge for our generation of politics and our generation of politicians. And you guys have to become part of that, not as spectators, not as people lobbying us, but actually as participants. And that's participants, I think, on a few different levels. So quite often people think, politicians are the only one making decisions on this. Actually, I think of it as a three-part. One is direct politics in terms of elected politics, and we need much more diverse voices in direct politics. Second is also in our civil service. So many of the decision-making happens around our civil service. You need young people engaging in our civil service. And the third part is media. So much of what shapes our priorities, so much what shapes our reaction is around what happens on media, traditional forms of media, and on social media. That's where we need to hear voices in Parliament, in the civil service, in media, on issues like the climate emergency, but also other issues as well that have been highlighted and exacerbated in the last year. So hold our feet to the fire on all of these issues.
Thanks, Anas. The right to have a say goes hand in hand with the right to education and accurate information, and this question is really important to us. It was developed by the young people who attended the warm-up event. How will you ensure that young people have compulsory environment and climate education at school? I would like to start with Douglas.
Well, clearly it's already part of the studies that young people have, both within primary and secondary schools. So I think we have to do more to ensure that it is prioritised. It's clearly an issue that young people are interested in. So we learn far better when we're looking at something and we're discussing something that we have a passion about. And we've just heard, and I was going through the chat function there, about how I think unimpressed young people have been from the answers from all of us in that last question. In fact, I think it was Tegan was saying, even as they posted their postal ballot this week, they felt they had no voice and no hope. So I think we all need to reflect on that. But it does mean that we can do more within our schools, but there is already a lot of the curriculum and a lot of learning around the climate emergency. I know my sister is a secondary school teacher here in Murray, and I know this comes up an awful lot. She's actually an English teacher, but she tells me how many young people, when they're asked to go away and write essays and do research, write their essays and put their interest and passion into schoolwork about the climate emergency and their solutions, their concerns, and what they would like to see done more in terms of dealing with it. So I think there's a good deal of work already being done within our schools, and that's driven by the demands of young people right now.
Thanks, Douglas. You said that it is already in the curriculum for primary and secondary. Just to clarify for the young people watching, please, what part that's in?
Well, for example, if you study, I mean, everyone still has to study sciences, so biology and such like looks at the environment going forward. As I say, you know, it's quite a strange link, but in English, my sister teaches a lot about it and has a lot of discussions about it, even down to even pre-primary ages. There's opportunities for young people to go to outdoor nurseries. We've got one about 5 miles away from our house here, and the number of young people that are looking to go to outdoor nurseries, so their families are choosing to put them there to learn about nature and the environment from the youngest age, I think is really encouraging, and we can see more of that. I'd like to see more outdoor nurseries and that develop further.
Thanks. If we could pass over to you now, Willie.
Thanks very much, Anna. It's not good enough just now. The Teach the Future have done a very effective campaign, and I've had meetings with, I think, all the politicians, including John Swinney, but we're not making fast enough progress. We need to have a specific, dedicated teaching in schools on the climate emergency, and that needs to change. We also, secondly, need to be incorporating the climate emergency into initial teacher education. And thirdly, we need to have specific materials which schools and teachers can use to assist with this development. Teach the Future have been, I think, very forthright on this, and I think we do need to change it. We understand that the curriculum is an intertwined and difficult thing to untangle at times, but we do need to go further and teach on the climate emergency, because the arrangements just now aren't satisfactory. This will help us in future generations if people understand more about the details of the climate emergency, and that's why it's so urgent that we do this.
Thank you. If we could pass over to you now, Anas.
Thanks again, Anna. I'll just emphasise what Willie said there. The question was about compulsory. It wasn't about optional. It was about compulsory education. And I think it has to be compulsory education around the climate emergency. I would go even further about other topics, but I'm not going to go off topic. But these are really sharp. This is going to be a generational shift. And the generational shift, I mean, we don't have time to wait for the next generation before we start taking action. But the next generation, going back to the last question, is not going to forgive us if this generation gets it wrong. So let's have compulsory education around the climate emergency so we can help inform. And the reason why that actually matters a lot is partly because of educating the young people and children across Scotland, and them then putting pressure on the decision makers. But actually educating our society is going to be a huge part of this as well. And so much of educating our society is going to have to be driven by the next generation. Children educating their parents, and then by extension, educating a community, and by extension, educating a society, so that people are willing to take the meaningful action. Because as others will tell you, a lot of what we're going to have to do to challenge the climate emergency is going to mean difficult decisions, is going to mean sometimes unpopular decisions. So unless we educate people on the reason why we're making these difficult decisions and these sometimes unpopular decisions is because there is a much bigger issue at play here, then that's going to require education to be at its heart. And education is such an important issue on all of these issues going forward. I also, just as again an extension of that, is I actually think we should have a climate focus on every single portfolio that we have across the whole of government, so we can understand what impact individual policies are making in terms of challenging the climate emergency or hindering the challenging of the climate emergency going forward.
Thank you. If we pass over to you now, Patrick, what do you think about compulsory climate education in school?
Yeah, I mean, even talking about using the word compulsory almost suggests that it's one specific subject that everyone ought to learn about. And I really think we need a broader understanding of what's required here. I can't remember who it was. It might have been Willie mentioned the Teach the Future campaign. We have a section in our manifesto that talks about teach the future and teach the past. There's been a lot more discussion and awareness recently about the way in which we need to face up to the past on issues like racism and colonialism, and a desire to look again at what we're teaching. We need to think just as deeply about teaching the future. Your adult lives are going to be defined by an era in human history that is fundamentally shaped by the climate and nature emergencies. And you are being taught to live in the 20th century. I think our education system still is designed to teach people for the 20th century. Never mind the technological changes that have happened since then and the economic changes that have happened in the early years of the 21st century. I don't think we're yet teaching how to live in the 21st century as it's going to be. Whether that's things like repair skills. This is not just about learning what is happening to climate as a subcategory of geography or something. This is about the skills that we're going to need to live sustainably. Because living sustainably is very different than living the way that most of us are living now. And that's not just by choice. Even if you really, really care passionately about this, it's incredibly difficult to live sustainably in today's modern industrialized society. And a lot of that is going to have to change. Values around consumerism. How is our educational system shaping those values? Values around food. Food in schools has always been a politically charged topic, with some people thinking that it's parents' responsibility to feed children, and so we must grudgingly do the bare minimum of that. Actually, education about how we relate to food could be really, really empowering. And there is a few council areas in Scotland that do that right, that have a connection with where food is coming from, that talk about the politics of food. It's not just about putting lunch on the table. It's about understanding our relationship to food, and food is so critical in terms of our environmental footprint. So, yeah, I think we do need a really, really deep look again at the curriculum. And this debate is happening at a time when we already know that we need to look deeply at how our education system works to recover from this grim year that we've all been living through, and it's been really tough. On everybody in education, teachers, parents, and pupils. So if we're going to look again at education, let's look deeply at how is it going to be to live in the 21st century? And is our education system preparing people for that? Because I think at the moment, it's still preparing people for a century that's already gone.
Thank you, Patrick. If we finish off this youth voice topic with you now, Nicola.
Thanks. The question was, should it be compulsory? And I think I agree with the spirit of that. If that means no young person should go to school and go through the whole school system without learning literally every day about the climate emergency, what causes it, how we tackle it. What I think we need to be careful about is that doesn't then lead to climate education becoming pigeonholed as a sort of discrete subject that doesn't have a connection into every other part of the curriculum. Curriculum for Excellence is meant to be about educating informed citizens that understand the world around them and understand their place in the world and how they shape the world. So every single subject a young person does in school should have a climate aspect to it, because just like Anna said earlier on about government needing to be more joined up, there's no aspect of our life that is not impacted by this, and there's no aspect of our life that we don't have to think about changing in order to tackle it, and that's got to be true across the curriculum as well. And I think we need to embed it more and make it much, much more mainstream. I agree with Patrick as well about it's got to be practical and not just theoretical. I think it's really important that young people learn about the causes of climate change and the climate emergency, and also in doing that learn what we need to do. But they also have to learn about how it is we live our own lives in a way that minimises the impact on the planet and tries to heal and protect the planet. I saw in the chat bar a little while ago somebody talking about the climate impact of COVID and disposable face masks. I was out campaigning in my own constituency today, and just along a verge, literally every 2 steps there was one of these disposable face masks. So as we go through different things, we create new ways of polluting, and we've got to really tackle and understand that. The last point I would make, and I saw again in the chat function somebody say sometimes young people know more than the teachers about all of this. One of the things in our manifesto is that we have to make, or we propose making, the climate emergency, the ecological crisis, a core part of teacher training, so that actually teachers are being educated in a way that then allows them to contribute to what needs to happen in the classroom as well. So I think there's a lot to do here. I do think it is one of these things where we have to have a really kind of fundamental look at how we design the curriculum to make sure it is just a mainstreamed, accepted part of everything that happens in a school.
Thank you so much, leaders and Anna, for that segment on youth. And there's been a lot of chat in the chat about this. And I want to remind all the leaders as well that we want to hear actions and commitments. We want more than just words. Josie says in the chat, who has the power? We can ask and demand and shout and make the small changes in our lives, but I can't plant a forest if I don't have access to land. And Molly says that young people shouldn't have to convince politicians to take action on the climate emergency. So there's been a lot of chat in there, and there's more chat going on social media as well. If you use the hashtag #ScottHotSeat, you can join in the conversation. Please do join in the conversation. This is a great opportunity to ask the questions that you want before the election that's coming up. So we're going to go back to Anna now for some more questions on emissions and waste. And plastic has been something that a few people have talked about. So it'd be interesting to hear people talk more about that.
Fossil fuels like coal, gas and oil contribute to global warming as well as harming our environment and communities in other ways. After our warm-up event, we discussed that Denmark has committed to end fossil fuel production by 2050. When do you think we in Scotland should stop producing fossil fuels? If we would start with you, Anas.
Thank you, Anna. A really important question. And, we hear a lot about the just transition. And I think one of the challenges we're going to have around making it a truly just transition is if we take communities with us. So as we transition away from the fossil fuel industry, we are going to get more and more pushback, and I see it from trade unions that are affiliated to the Labour Party. So I know it firsthand. We're going to get more and more pushback from industry and from unions about the risks to jobs, the risks to employability, and the challenges that's going to face for particularly communities and largely working class communities who are employed around the fossil fuel industry. So we've got to start urgently planning around the just transition. So it's actually just in terms of that transition to alternative jobs, which is around the renewables industry, around tech, helping people transition to those new jobs, to learn those new skills, to have confidence that that's the way we're going to move. It also means diversifying our energy supply, so we are less reliant on the fossil fuel industry as well in the process. And also, we've made a commitment around, net zero by 2045, by a 75% reduction by 2030. I think the pressure we should put on ourselves is that shouldn't be the frame of that's when we want to get it done by. We should be saying we're more ambitious than that. That's our deadline. But in actual fact, as people have already said, I've heard Patrick say it numerous times before. I've heard lots of people say it to me on virtual doorsteps as well around, we've only got 10 years left to get this right, is we should be doing everything we can to try and pull those targets forward as well as we can and see those as very, very strict deadlines that we should aspire to finish earlier on. But specifically on the point around the fossil fuel industry, look, I would love us to end the fossil fuel industry, but we've got to make sure it's a genuinely just transition and take those communities with us and move us into those new industries of the future. It makes economic sense for us in Scotland to do that. We have the ability in Scotland to do that, but it also makes the sense for us around challenging the climate emergency. And as we focus our economy coming through this recovery, as we start investing in new technologies, as we start investing in the new economies that we want to try and train people to go into in terms of the new employment and labour market post-pandemic, that's the area I think we need to largely focus on, is around the renewables industry, green jobs and tech.
Thank you. We can come to you now, Nicola, about Scotland's production of fossil fuels.
So I think this is one of the hardest issues, I think, for politicians in Scotland. You know, the North Sea oil and gas industry has been for such a long time such an important part of our economy, and there's lots of jobs depend on it, but that does not get anybody off the hook in terms of the climate imperative of moving away from reliance on fossil fuels. I want us to end our reliance on fossil fuels as quickly as we possibly can, but we've got to focus on what it takes to do that. And we've firstly got to, basically diversify our energy in order that we don't need to use fossil fuels. We're already in a position in Scotland where just short of 100% of our electricity comes from renewable sources, but we've got to repeat that when it comes to transport. We've got to replicate that in terms of how we heat our houses and buildings, and all of our manifestos, I think, are full of what we're going to do around that. And we do have to make sure that we're not abandoning people who currently rely on that industry for jobs. I grew up in Ayrshire. I was a teenager in Ayrshire in the 1980s, when we were going through the process of deindustrialisation, and the government at the time literally abandoned coal and steel workers and their families and communities. And I saw that, I saw the impact of that when I was growing up. We cannot allow that to happen as we make this transition. So we do have to think about retraining, reskilling, moving people from the jobs that they're in just now into the jobs of the future. And that is absolutely, I think, at the heart of what all of us are saying. It would be, I think all of us, it would be much easier at sessions like this, in front of audiences like this, just to say we'll end it now. And, Patrick, fair play to Patrick will, and that's perfectly, understandable and legitimate. But I think we need to do the hard work, and we need to do it as quickly as possible to make sure that we are not reliant on fossil fuels. What we don't want to do is, have a situation where we end up importing more energy because we haven't created the replacements here, and that is counterproductive in terms of the climate emergency. And we need to make sure that we are supporting people into new jobs. I would not want us to repeat the mistakes of the past, because actually that leaves an entire generation scarred as a result.
We can come to you now, Willie.
So there's a project in Leavenmouth in Fife where it's a hydrogen project, and they're using the gas network, that's the plan, to use the gas network to put hydrogen in it up to 25%, because when you go above 25%, you have to change the boiler systems. But they're doing that as a project. They're building 3 houses initially that are going to utilise this new process. It's projects like that are going to help us reduce the demand on oil and gas, because that's what we need to do right across the continent, reduce our demand, because cutting the supply in itself won't actually solve the problem. The gas will come from somewhere else. So we need urgent action to make more of these projects happen. So for instance, I've been slightly mocked for being in favour of having 1 million heat pumps in homes. I think actually those kind of projects, we're installing very small numbers just now. I think we need to have a dramatic increase in the use of air source or ground source heat pumps. That's the kind of technology that is going to reduce our demand on the fossil fuels. So that's what we need to do in transport. We need to use hydrogen in transport. There's some projects around about buses that are doing that. We need to have, if we can't get people into public transport, the use of more electric vehicles with charging points, fast charging points across the country. Those are the kind of things that will help us do that transition, because Nicola is absolutely spot on. We cannot repeat the 1980s. We need to make sure we do this responsibly and create the jobs for people, retrain, reskill people so that they are taken with us on this project. Now, that doesn't make it any less urgent. It doesn't mean you go any slower than anybody else, What it means is that we have to plan this properly rather than leaving people in the lurch without incomes, without jobs, and without a future. That was done in the past, and we can't go there again. We need that just transition. So let's build the technologies. Let's make sure we install them, we pilot them, we train people, we create the thousands and thousands of jobs that will be required to do all these projects. Then we can have that transition that will work for the future.
We can come over to you now, Patrick. When do you think Scotland will stop producing fossil fuels?
I mean, this is going to be one of the dividing lines between us. That all the parties will talk about the good stuff that we want to do, but not all the parties will talk about stopping doing the bad stuff. I wouldn't for a moment mock Willie when he talks about the heat pumps. The scale of ambition is laudable there. I think it may be just a little bit simplistic because heat pumps aren't the right technology for every building, but the scale of ambition is laudable, and I support that. And I agree very much with what Nicola said about the previous generations that suffered deindustrialization without the proper economic planning to put something else in its place. But talking about a just transition, about making this change fairly without leaving people on the economic scrap heap is hugely important. But a transition that is too slow is just the same as not bothering trying at all. It has to be just, it has to be fair, but it has to be fast. The world has far more fossil fuel than we can afford to burn if we're remotely serious about our survival and the survival of the rest of the living world around us. The UK has something like 3 times as much fossil fuel than it can use if it wants to meet just the Paris climate commitments, never mind the stronger commitments that have to come from the next COP, which hopefully will be in Glasgow this year. So our position is, given that there's 4.5 billion barrels or so of equivalent of 4.5 billion barrels of oil in the North Sea, that's far more than we can afford to burn. First step, stop going looking for more. Most political parties are still supporting new exploration licenses, letting oil companies go and drill looking for more when we've already got more of the stuff than we can use. So no new exploration licenses. Let's call back the ones that haven't been developed, because there are licenses that have already been issued where that exploration hasn't been developed. So revoke those. And over the next 10 years, we should remove oil and gas subsidies and tax breaks. And if we do that, not only will that mean that over those 10 years, we'll see a substantial reduction in oil and gas extraction, but we'll also have that money available to invest in the alternative. Now, over that 10-year period, if by the end of that, there is still a little bit of residual oil and gas extraction, frankly, we can live with that. We can cope with the cost of that environmentally, because we'll be able to count that against, for example, reforestation that will soak up much more carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the kind of timescale that we're looking at. I'm not hearing a clear timescale from anybody else. And at the end of the day, we cannot negotiate with the climate. You cannot say to the climate, but please, we need the jobs. That doesn't cut it. So the timescale has to be set by the science. And what the science says is that we cannot burn the stuff that we've already found. We can't burn more than 1/3 of it. So let's stop kidding ourselves that the transition can be slow enough to be easy. When in an emergency situation now, it demands an emergency response. And that means investing now in warm homes, public transport, restoring nature and renewable energy, the kind of stuff that will create the jobs that will be there for the future. And anyone whose job is currently dependent on the fossil fuel industry knows already that industry is coming to an end, because if we don't end it, it will end us.
Patrick, one thing I think that people would like to know is, what year would you want to end oil and gas extraction?
Yeah, I mean, what I've said is that if you start taking away the tax breaks and the subsidies, then over the next 10 years from now, you would see a very substantial reduction. Now, if there is a tiny bit of oil and gas extraction still happening in residual fields in 10 years' time, I think we can tolerate that. It's you know, the absolute end date of the very last drop is much less important than the scale of moving away from it now. That's what we have to be doing. So yeah, the bulk of the production should be ending in 10 years. And I think we can do that. And I think we can invest in the alternative. And I make the comparison with Longannet, actually, just very briefly, because I know I'm talking too long here on this one. But Longannet was Scotland's last coal-fired power station. And everybody knew it was going to close. Everybody knew it was coming to the end of its life. And you had the Scottish government and the local government and the owners and the trade unions all saying, no, no, we're fully committed to the long-term future of this plant. The last decade of that plant's operation should have been wholly committed to investing in what that community needed when it ended. But what happened instead was we all, you know, all these people saying, no, no, we're fully committed to the plant. And then when it was announced it's closing, then you set up a jobs task force. We are in danger of doing that on a massive scale in Scotland and failing the communities that are currently reliant on the oil and gas industry, because it is going to end. That's not negotiable.
Thank you, Patrick. If we just finish off this fossil fuels question with you, Douglas.
Thanks. And I was just reading Zoe's point in the chat there. She was the last one saying that, yes, the climate is the priority, but we can't just immediately see over 100,000 jobs in the northeast of Scotland and right across the country under threat. So that's why a transition is important. That's why the UK government have agreed the first ever oil and gas transition deal out of any of the G7 nations. It's £16 billion working with the sector. I think that's a really important thing, is working with the sector. They understand they need to change. They understand we need to evolve and develop, and they want to come with governments. They want to work to protect the people who are already employed by them, and they want to look to greener renewable forms of energy. And I think it's really important that, particularly as we are facing, you know, a looming economic crisis, we've all got a big responsibility, as others have said, in terms of the climate emergency we are leaving your generation with, but we're also leaving you with a huge economic emergency as well, given what we've been through in the last year. So I think the transition deal is absolutely right. Bring the sector with us, and there are innovative ideas in there to seek to move away from oil and gas into more renewable forms of energy. But the other point, and it has been touched upon in fairness by other leaders, Tom put in a point in chat. Yes, it's a lot about drilling and production, but it's also an awful lot about how we use energy ourselves. And over a fifth of our greenhouse gas emissions in Scotland come from homes and workplaces. 45% of homes in Scotland have an EPC rating of C or lower. And the Scottish Government's own figures from February of this year said we need to transition 2 million homes in Scotland off of fossil fuels for heating and energy to get to net zero by 2045. So yes, we've got to look at the oil and gas sector and transition, but we've also got to look at how we are operating ourselves, what we can do. So Scottish Conservatives, for example, have set out plans for £2.5 billion to improve the energy efficiency of homes and businesses across Scotland. I think it was Willie who was mentioning electric vehicles. I spoke to someone in the northeast today when I was out campaigning, and he was so proud of this new electric car he got, and he wanted to tell me all about it. But he also told me how worried he was about driving too far because we don't have enough charging points across the country. So if we're asking people to come with us on this journey, then we've got to provide them as a government and as politicians here in Scotland with opportunities to do that. So we need to do far more to make our homes and our businesses more energy efficient, and we need to give people the tools such as charging points, accessible charging points, more of them across Scotland, if they also want to play their part by moving from diesel vehicles to electric vehicles.
Thank you, Douglas. I know a few of the leaders have already mentioned about plastic, so I think this next question is another really important one. Mia, 18, from Dumfries and Galloway, wanted to know about plastic. Will you ban all single-use plastic? We'll start with you, Anas.
Thanks, Anna. Yes, I would, with one caveat, and the one caveat I put on it is, and this has particularly come from disability campaigners that are talking about some specific materials that they use around single-use plastic. So I think we just need to see how we can transition and support people with with disabilities around that. But in
Sorry
principle,
to interrupt here, but we just want a yes or no answer to this question.
the answer is yes.
We'll come over to you now, Willie.
Yes. Yeah.
Nicola,
Yes.
Patrick,
Yes.
Douglas.
Full house, yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. That was nice and efficient. So I know that Anas has to leave soon. So we'll let you do your closing statements probably at some point in the next bit, but I'm moving on to Dylan now for questions on climate change and climate justice and targets.
Hi everyone, so my name is Dylan. I'm a 16-year-old climate and environmental activist from West Lothian, and I went on strike from school for the climate in February 2019, and I've continued to do that every single Friday since. So leading on from what we talked about earlier with young people being engaged in climate change, I want you all to take a second to process what that actually means. Every single Friday for 123 weeks consecutively, I have refused to focus on my education and instead dealt with a problem that you should have dealt with. We're still not dealing with it. If the comments here have shown us anything, young people don't agree that you've done what is necessary either. Our education doesn't come close to covering the severity of climate change. Higher geography even teaches the benefits of climate change, and many schools don't even have environmental science as an available subject. To the point of specifically climate change, which this next section is about, our carbon budget gives us about 6 to 9 years of current emissions to stay below 1.5 degrees. I will be at most 25 years old then. I'll just be out of my education and entering my adult life. And we have talked quite a bit about anger, and I want to assure you all, we are very, very angry. We are trying to knock down your doors. I have sacrificed my education and having a normal childhood to pressure you to fix a problem that we've known about since over a decade before I was even born. If that doesn't constitute banging down your doors, I don't know what does. And while I am angry, you should also be angry that I even feel the need to spend my youth on this issue because it's been so ignored. All of the important climate deadlines, 2030, 2045, 2050, I will live through. If I live to the same age as my granny lived to, I will see the next century. This is my future life, and it's the lives of people all around the world right now. You should not be inspired by us. You should be angry and upset. Working since September is admirable, but for example, this is my hires year during a global pandemic and I have a chronic illness. I should have enough to worry about without having to worry about the possibility of the largest refugee crisis we've ever seen by the time I reach my middle ages. I apologise for taking up a lot of time with that, but I felt it was incredibly important to address this. I respect what has been done so far, but we need more, and that's what we want to hear from you tonight. We cannot have less than what is necessary, regardless of how far ahead it is of the rest of the world. There's no use in being the fastest snail. With all of that in mind, our next question is a combination of one from Freya, who's 15, and Erin from East Lothian. The first part is, what is your plan for climate action over the next 5 years? And the second part is, climate change is an issue of social justice, and it disproportionately affects minorities and disadvantaged groups, such as people of colour and those in poverty. How do you plan to tackle this?
Anas, we can go to you first, and then I'll let you know when you've got your last 2 minutes for your closing statement as well.
Thank you, Michaela, and can I also thank you, Dylan, like other people have done in the chat, for your passion and your commitment. My eldest son was one of the climate protesters. He's not quite gone as far as doing it every week, so I applaud your bold response to that. A couple of things. I'll answer the second part in a moment about some specifics about what we want to try and see and do in the next 5 years. But you also raise a really important point around the, climate change doesn't recognize borders. So yes, I want us to be the most ambitious. Yes, I want us to be leading from the front. Yes, I want us to be world leading in Scotland. But we've also got to try and inspire international cooperation if we are going to challenge climate change and stop all the rising sea levels and the mass migration and the refugee crisis that's going to come from it, which is also going to hit us in so many other ways. And so we have an opportunity in Glasgow in November. I know there's still some flexibility in the details about how big COP26 may well be in terms of size and scale in Glasgow in November, but we have got to come through COP26 in November with what I like to call the Glasgow Agreement, the time that the international community didn't start just talking about these issues, but actually made serious and good about not just putting commitments, but actually backing up those commitments with action so the world can challenge the climate emergency. So it's not just Scotland leading the world, but actually other countries across the UK, other nations across the UK and other countries across the world are also taking action to confront the climate emergency, because we are running out of time. In terms of some specifics, as I say, I like to think about it in terms of every portfolio around how we can challenge the climate emergency. So thinking about transport, how we have greater public transport and diversification of routes around public transport in Scotland, how we make as much of that as free as possible, particularly for young people, so we can try and get people off gas guzzling vehicles and into public transport, publicly owned even better. Thinking about housing, how do we get every home across the country at least grade C by 2030 around their own efficiency in their homes? How do we retrofit all those homes across the country? How do we make sure that any new homes we build are climate efficient? Looking at employability, how do we, because we've got to do a massive stimulus in our economy and a massive job creation scheme across our economy, how do we think about creating those jobs in the green economy so people can go work in those new industries, so we can have that just transition we were talking about in the last question? In our education system, how do we teach the right skills mix so people can then go and work in those renewable industries and those new technologies of the future? But also within education, what are we teaching our young people in their school? We talked about the curriculum already. What are we teaching to educate our wider communities and our wider society about what they can do in terms of their personal behaviour, but also about the behaviour they can inspire around them in their community? Douglas mentioned about recharging points. How do we recharging points across the country, and how we think about infrastructure across the country? How do we set ambitious targets, which we should see as deadlines, which we pull towards further forward? All of these things and so much more, I think we need to be ambitious in every single portfolio over the next 5 years and beyond.
Thank you. And because if people weren't here at the start, Anas has to go early as he's breaking fast for Ramadan with his family. And so that's why you're going to have your closing 2 minutes here, and everyone else will have their closing 2 minutes at the end of the event. So you can go ahead now.
I was hoping I was going to be able to take advantage of all the hard questions being at the end, and I would have been away by then. But thankfully, you started off right at the start with the hard questions, and rightfully challenged every single one of us to do more. And not just, I think you used the words, Michaela, not just words, but actions. So I suppose I just want to end by saying that I take the fact that we need to focus on a national recovery very, very seriously. And we've got to make sure that national recovery has a climate recovery at its heart, has a nature recovery at its heart, and judge us on actions, not just words. That's going to be right across every single portfolio if we're going to make that a reality, so we can confront the climate emergency together. That's going to require cooperation across the UK. It's also going to require international cooperation too. And the final point I'll end on is, again, I'll repeat those 3 words: impatient, fizzing, angry. We need young people's voices to be front and centre of our decision making. And I'll take the opportunity to say, not just on climate change. We need young people's voices to be front and centre about how we stop the whitewashing of our education system, so we teach the true history of our country, and therefore make people have a sense of belonging and identity, so they feel an equal part of our society. Young people pushing us towards education in the round, and Nicola and Patrick made this point, not just a siloed education, but actually teaching the necessary skills going forward from that as well. And crucially, let's get more of these young voices into the parliament, into the decision-making structures, into every single political party, so we don't view the climate emergency as being one track or one part of our politics, but mainstream in our politics across all of our mainstream political parties as well. So I hope people will appreciate that we take it really seriously. I take it very seriously. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I know collectively from people across Scotland, whether that be our young people, whether that be our individual third sector organisations, whether it be advocates, whether it be our people in our education sector, collectively we can challenge the climate emergency, take it on, and come through this crisis, which has been the most difficult of years in our lifetime, come through this crisis as a stronger, fairer, more equal and greener nation too. And I look forward to going on that journey with each and every single one of you. And I apologise, I'm having to leave it slightly early. But thanks for having us, Michaela and the team.
Thank you so much for being here, and Ramadan Mubarak, and I hope that you and your family enjoy breaking your fast. Thank you for coming. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I'll pass it back to Dylan now.
Thanks for Anas for coming. He's gone now, but yeah, Douglas, would you like to go next?
Dylan, I also, as Anas has said, want to thank you for what you said, but also know how condescending that sounds, that 5 leaders of political parties across Scotland saying, oh, you did really well. It's the comments you've got in that chat box from your peers tells you you've hit the nail on the head. You don't need political leaders to tell you you're right, political leaders who've let you down. Your own peers are telling you you have spoken with more passion than any of us can speak on an issue that you and your colleagues are rightly demanding action on. So I don't want to move on without acknowledging that, and it was deeply hard-hitting for me to hear that from you. But I also know they're just words from politicians, and unless we do something about it, you'll be seeing this in a few months or a few years' time, and we'll be even more annoyed. So in terms of some of the things, because your question was more on, what plans do we have? I've already set out some of the plans. So the nature bill that I discussed earlier on, we've also got plans to introduce a circular economy bill. I think it's really important. There were plans for that were dropped in the previous parliament that we need to get back in again. We've also outlined plans for a green growth recovery. So it's ensuring that as we seek to tackle the issues with climate change, we do create a great number of jobs around the country going forward as well. Public transport has been mentioned. I was speaking today about our plans for infrastructure, which is about roads and railways and infrastructure across Scotland, but also about making it easier for people to use public transport, because long before the pandemic hit, our public transport was very much underused, and there are opportunities there to take people out of vehicles, off the road and into greener forms of transport. For example, on apprenticeships as well. I think, a lot of people who are passionate about the climate emergency would want to go into an area of work where there are opportunities to really make a difference. So I want to see our apprenticeship scheme expanded here in Scotland. At the moment, we don't use all £247 million of the apprenticeship levy. I've said it should be more business driven rather than government driven, but there are certainly opportunities there for young people who, when they leave school, who have been so passionate about an issue and want to get straight in to deal with this. Let's make it easier to do that within businesses who are looking to work in green energy, in more renewable forms of energy, and make it easier for apprenticeships in these businesses as well. So again, I think there'll be a lot of consensus on this. There are issues that we've heard tonight that all of the parties have similar plans for, and I think it's absolutely right, because we all have an ultimate goal. We see slightly different ways to get there, but actually there's also an awful lot we share in common in terms of how we can tackle this, how we can deliver it. And I am absolutely certain, based on your opening remarks, you are going to hold our feet to the fire and keep us accountable over the next few years, because if we don't, we'll be back round here hearing another passionate speech from you, but you'll rightly be even more angry.
Yep, can't tell you how many times I've given a passionate speech at this point. Next up is Nicola Sturgeon.
Thanks, Dylan, and I'm not going to patronise you by saying well done, but you're right to be brutally frank with us. You shouldn't have to do what you're doing, and the rest of us have to reflect really, really hard on the fact that you are. I mean, I think some of us said earlier on that you should bang down our doors and you should sort of lobby us and not accept that we're not doing things, and I think that was understandably interpreted as us passing the buck to the younger generation. I don't think that is certainly not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is don't underestimate your power. Don't underestimate the absolutely enormous capacity for force and change that you have. But the responsibility lies on those of us who hold the power right now to step up and do more and stop failing you. And I think it's important to recognise that. To come to the question though, so Scotland's climate change targets right now are sufficient. If the whole world had the same targets as Scotland and met those targets, the world would do enough to meet the Paris Agreement of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. So part of what we need to play our part in trying to achieve at COP26 in Glasgow is making sure that the world actually comes up with binding agreements that will deliver the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. Countries that take part in COP, they have to submit what's called nationally determined contribution, setting out how they're going to do all of that. Scotland doesn't have to do that. We're not an independent country, but we're going to choose to do that, to set out exactly what Scotland is going to do to meet those targets. I think there are aspects of Scotland's targets that I think are important beyond the headline commitment, 2045, net zero, ending our contribution to climate change. Actually, the 2030 75% target is probably more important in the short term, because that forces the pace of action that is required. We also have annual emissions targets that help to force that change as well. So I think that is about making sure that it's not a 2045 well into the future target that people like us think, well, we've got plenty of time. The change is being forced and driven now. What we're going to do, we have to replicate what we've done in electricity across every other aspect of the way we live our lives. We've got to decarbonise transport. That absolutely means electric and low emission vehicles, but it means reducing our reliance on cars. We want to reduce car use significantly. That means better public transport, investing massively in our bus infrastructure, for example, making bus travel more affordable. One of the things the SNP and the Greens have worked together on is to make bus travel free for everybody under 22, to encourage use of public transport, decarbonising the railway. One of the things that we want to do, and I think it's probably agreed by all parties, is renationalise the railway and decarbonise the railway as we do that. We've got to heat our homes differently. We want to see 1 million net zero homes by the next few years. We've got to invest massively in that. We've got to change agriculture practices, land use practices, all of this. We have to get
I'm really sorry to interrupt, but we're kind of running out of time, and this question needs to be focused on climate justice from everyone, as that's what we kind of want to be talking about. But I'll let you could have a
my apologies.
So
the climate justice, I think two brief points, because I've spoken for a long time, I'll make here. Climate justice at home, it is those who live in conditions of greatest poverty and inequality that contribute least to climate change and pay the biggest price. And as we talk about a just transition, that's got to be part of what we talk about. But we've got a massive obligation to the parts of the world that have contributed least and bear the biggest impact of climate change. Scotland, this is something I think we should be proud of. We were the first country in the world to set up a climate justice fund where we help other countries to adapt to climate change. We want to double that over the next few years. So that's an important part of this that we absolutely shouldn't lose sight of.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Willie Rennie. And again, this is very important about climate justice. So hearing about that would be great.
Thanks very much. I can just say that the international role in this is really important, because while we're doing some modest good work so far in Scotland, we need to do an awful lot more. But while we're doing that, the hungry beasts of China and America are consuming huge amounts of carbon. So we need to use COP26 to change that. And Biden coming in does help. It changes the dialogue significantly, and that will help us do that. We need to have enlightened self-interest in the way that Nicholas just described, of helping other countries to deal with their carbon issues, to help them transition into new forms of energy, so that as they grow, and it's right that they grow and improve their standard of living, they do so in a sustainable way, and they don't just use the old bad practices that may be cheaper for them to do in the short term, but aren't good for the climate. So we need to make that happen as well. The final thing we need to do is to make sure that the communities in Scotland that are paying the price, that we need to have particular catch-up zones for improvements in home energy, because home energy costs are considerable for people on low incomes. We need to be able to reduce those costs significantly. So we need catch-up zones for them to be able to make sure that they benefit from it as well. So we need action in terms of transport, for cutting the carbon emissions from that. We need to open new railway lines. We need to cut back on the airline industry. The third runway at Heathrow, I think, should not be going ahead, and we shouldn't support it. We need to make sure that in terms of heat pumps and other low emission technologies for homes, that needs to be advanced, the use of hydrogen, also in transport as well as in district heating systems. All of those good technologies need to be showcased at COP26 to encourage the rest of the world to do the same. We've got a role at home with social justice and climate justice, as well as abroad. So we need to play our role in all of that to make it happen.
Thank you. Just a quick point on the China and American point you made, as it's been brought up in the chat quite a few times now. The average Scot emits 10.3 tons of CO2 annually, which is actually higher than the UK's average, which is one of the top most emitting countries in the world. So while we do have a smaller population, we definitely have a lot of the responsibility to bear. Patrick, you're next.
Thanks very much, Dylan. And as you know, this isn't the first time that I've witnessed Dylan's awesomeness and anger. I mentioned my mum earlier. She's nearly 80 now, and she's been campaigning on this stuff since before I was born. Dylan, you're almost as angry as my mum, but you're clearly determined to turn that anger to good effect as well. I mean, some of the stuff domestically that Nicola was talking about, like free bus travel for young people, is a good example of trying to make sure that the changes domestically in our society are also socially just. And I like Nicola's policy of free bikes for young people as well, that they announced with their manifesto. It would really help if we didn't have the really dangerous environment for us all to be cycling in. I saw Jem mentioned in the chat box the car culture that is still so dominant. You know, continuing with that car culture is also socially unjust. Because it benefits those with the most money. Shifting away from that, taking space away from the dominant kind of private car mode of transport is social justice as well as environmental justice, because it's redistributing a resource to those who and making it possible for them to travel sustainably for less money. I would like to see that ultimately to free public transport generally across the board. The global issues as well. You know, there are some small, narrow technical questions about how we do this stuff, like giving away technology rather than selling it, like you know, the UK government's appalling decision to cut international development spending, and not just to cut it, but to tie it to UK domestic economic interests. Those are appalling decisions. We need to be committing to make sure that we're an open, generous contributor to the world on these issues. But underneath those narrow kind of technical issues about how we do stuff, there is a really, really big issue that we don't talk about enough. Capitalism is an economic system which is geared specifically to extracting resource, both from people and from the planet, and turning it into profit. It's an incredibly efficient machine for extracting resource and turning it into profit. It's incredibly inefficient at distributing that profit fairly to meet everybody's needs. But it is also a system that is fundamentally addicted to growth. GDP growth is still on a pinnacle for most economists. More. And it doesn't matter what you're measuring, they just want more of it. The world needs to move away from that. The world needs an economic model that is not based on perpetual economic growth, because we've only got the one planet, and perpetual economic growth on a planet of finite resources simply does not work. Eventually, the system cracks. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing the consequence of an economic model that doesn't fit on this planet. So capitalism is the root cause of the problem that we're trying to identify. And I genuinely think we need to name it for what it is.
Thank you so much for that. After this, we're going to go straight to audience questions, but first we have a quick input from Col on what was just said. So
very briefly, Patrick, I'd love to comment on that. I think that's so important, and I don't think we've heard enough about systemic change tonight, if I'm honest. I mean, the stats speak for themselves. 100 companies responsible for 70% of emissions since 1988. The richest 1% emit double the carbon of the poorest 50%. The stats are there. We have to understand that capitalism lends itself to things like greenwashing, and we will see companies try their best to lend themselves to a market in which climate is dealt with. But for as long as we have a system which is predicated on profit and expansion, we'll never be able to tackle climate justice in the manner necessary to address the crisis. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, we really can't solve this without system change. On that note, we're going to go to audience questions. So we've had over 50 questions. So obviously we can't ask them all, but thank you so much for sending them all in. We're going to go to a question from Mary, who's 20, from Dumfries and Galloway, which is, as we come through COVID, will party leaders embrace the opportunity to create an economic system whose indicators of success represent the health of the people and our planet, rather than prioritising GDP growth, which is depleting natural resources at an ever-increasing rate and is only causing social inequalities to grow? We'll go to Nicola Sturgeon first.
In a word, yes. I mean, the answer to that question is bigger and more complicated, but I've got a lot of sympathy with what Patrick has just said there about not chasing GDP growth all of the time and making that the sole metric of success or failure in the economy. We want to see Scotland have a well-being economy. We want to see our budgets basically determined by not just economic metrics, but are we a healthy, happy, fulfilled population? We're the founding country of an international organisation called Wellbeing Governments. We're in it with Iceland and New Zealand. Denmark's joined, Wales has just joined, and I absolutely think that. I think the days of judging everything by GDP, politicians, put a lot of store on monthly, quarterly GDP stats, and actually what it means to be a successful economy is much, much wider and more fundamental than that. So in short, yes, I do agree with that.
Thank you. We'll go to Douglas Ross next.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think we have to remember, to be a happy and healthy country, we need to pay for a lot of the services people rely on day in, day out. We've all made very bold, ambitious promises tonight. We've all made very bold, ambitious promises tonight that have to be paid for. We cannot tackle the climate emergency facing us right now without having significant investment. Every single leader tonight has addressed your concerns, maybe not as full as you would like, by offering solutions that cost significant investment. And we cannot do that by assuming that if our GDP is not important at all, we'll be able to afford everything that's being offered. I do accept, that there's an opportunity to look at other things rather than GDP alone. I don't think any economy or any country simply looks at GDP on its own, but you cannot ignore the fact that we need the money to provide the services that we are all using day in, day out, and to provide the investment we need to change our economy, to change our climate, and to change our country.
Nicola, you responded to that. Is there something you'd like to say?
I think with respect, I think that's a mischaracterisation of what we're saying. Of course, we need to create the revenues and the wealth to fund our health service and our education system and the investment and all the things we're talking about. But I do think governments, it's not that it's the only thing that, is taken account of, but a lot of focus is put on GDP almost as if it is the sole thing. And my point is it's not the only thing. How healthy and wealthy and happy and fulfilled, whether or not we are bequeathing a good planet and climate to the next generation, these things have to be taken much more account of. And we find we have to get away from a situation where we only value what we can most easily measure, which is why I think GDP has become this disproportionate aspect of how we measure economic success. So I don't think it's true to say it's about not saying we have to create the wealth we need, but we need a broader assessment of what makes a healthy, happy country.
And I think, Dylan, if I can just quickly come back in, that's what I said at the end of my answer. It is not just GDP, but it is a big fact of how we pay for an NHS, how we pay for our education system, how we pay for all the investment we need to put into our homes and our businesses over the next Parliament to make them more energy efficient. So it is absolutely, it may not be what people want to hear, but it is absolutely a crucial part of how we recover our economy and recover our country.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to come in here and say that we need to move on to the next person. So thank you both for that. But Dylan, do you want to go ahead and go on to the next person?
Yeah. Sorry about the time problems. Willie or Rennie, would you like to go?
If you don't measure something, it often isn't a factor in government decision making. And all of these additional factors about quality of life, about sustainability, about happiness, actually need to be a part of government decision making. But too often GDP dominates, and the decisions that flow from that drive a different kind of decision making and policy making process. So that's why you do need to have a much more comprehensive way of measuring what really counts. What is it that makes a difference to our lives? Not just our lives, but our neighbours, people across the world, and also in the future. All of that needs to be considered. And GDP is quite narrow. It is quite focused on a very kind of limited set of factors. And that's why a more comprehensive system that has been trialled in many countries, and we're dabbling with
I'm
it.
sorry to interrupt here, but could we just push for like an answer to the question? Just more concisely if possible.
Well, I'm in favour, yeah. Okay, yes, I'm in favour.
Okay, fab. And Dylan, do you want to move on?
Yeah, last but not least, Patrick Harvey.
Yeah, I'll try and be quick because I addressed some of this in the last answer. But, you know, I think Nicola's government has taken some steps in this direction. They are not complete steps. GDP growth is still at the pinnacle, even if it's called sustainable growth. Now, I believe sustainable growth is a contradiction in terms. There are some aspects of our economy that can be allowed to grow. I want renewable electricity to grow, for example. I want sustainable transport to grow. But the overall level of economic activity globally, a huge proportion of it is always going to be based on the use of resources. And if the global economy continues to grow, then ultimately it reaches limits, and it has already breached those limits. This debate is older than I am. People have been talking about this since the 60s, that GDP measures all of the good stuff and all of the bad stuff and just calls it stuff and says we need more stuff. It just measures the value of financial transactions going around the economy. It doesn't actually tell you what is the difference between economic activity that supports human health, human well-being, the resilience of our environment, our ecosystem, and what is the economic activity that destroys and degrades these things. So for as long as this notion of either placing GDP on a pinnacle, whether it's alongside other things or not, or the notion of perpetual growth on a finite planet, for as long as these ideas persist and continue to dominate, then we're going to be making these problems worse, not better. And I actually think most people, in the way they live their lives, understand the concept of enough. The last thing I'll say is, I will not listen to any argument about how on earth are we going to pay for this from a politician who wants to spend vast sums on another generation of nuclear weapons, or who's willing to give away tax cuts to high earners. How are you going to pay for that kind of largesse? Well, I think we need to be redirecting those kind of resources to investments that are for the common good of humanity and of the world around us.
Thank you so much for all of you. That's the end of these questions. I will quickly say on the health and well-being part that I referenced earlier at the beginning of what I was saying is it doesn't entirely matter if we don't fix this, because we have to do what is necessary or we will suffer. 2 billion people will likely lose their land to the climate crisis if we don't do what is necessary. I don't think they're going to find that very happy and healthy, if I'm honest. I'll pass back to Michaela now for closing statements. Thank you.
So we are coming to an end of our time here tonight. Thank you to Dylan, Cole and Anna for all the questions and all the things that you've done. You've done amazing work in creating this event. So to close, we have given each leader 2 minutes to summarise their party's position on the environment and climate. And for this, we'll be starting with Will Rennie, and I will have to interrupt you if you go over your 2 minutes, so please try and keep within the 2 minutes.
Yeah, this has been excellent. Thanks for the feisty engagement. I think you've made us all feel uncomfortable, which is a good thing. I think democracy is a boiling pot of different and competing issues, and elections give us an opportunity to put our jobs up to you, for you to decide whether you think we should continue. So this is the sharp end, and I'm grateful for you being very blunt with us, because I think that is important. Practical action, we've listed lots of that this evening in terms of transport, home energy, industrial systems, making sure we measure things differently, international development, which Liberal Democrats have been at the forefront of making sure was 0.7% of GDP, because it's about making sure we help the rest of the planet as well as ourselves. We need to make sure we contribute to the sustainable development of our country. We need to make sure that it's done with justice. We need a just transition, but we also need social justice in our communities. All of that is absolutely essential if we are going to get a planet that we can leave to future generations, and be proud of leaving it to future generations in a better state than we found it. So there are opportunities here to make change, and you can be part of all that change. Just hold us to account. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak this evening, and I'm going to stop there so I don't run over.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Patrick Harvey now.
Thanks very much. This has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you for organising it and inviting us along. A lot of the discussion has faced up to really, really difficult, daunting issues, and it can often feel frightening. It can create a lot of anxiety to face up to the challenges that your generation has been left with to face. I genuinely believe, though, that this is a moment of incredible historic opportunity. The recovery from COVID, right, around the world, governments are saying we need an investment-led recovery. Even tepid centre-right politicians are saying they need the state to invest for the future. Now, I believe that that gives us the chance to reshape our society and our economy on a scale not seen since the generation that came through the Second World War. They built a welfare state and a social security system and a national health service, something to be proud of. And for decades after that, this country's economy became gradually more and more equal. Now, a lot of that legacy has been ripped up by successive UK governments. But this is now a moment of opportunity when we can invest for the future. The Green Manifesto in this election is about that investment-led recovery in renewables, in warm homes, in public transport, and in restoring nature. And if we do this, we have the opportunity to address the climate and nature emergencies, but also end up with a fairer and more equal and healthier society to live in. So what we're asking everybody in Scotland to do at this election is vote like our future depends on it, because it really does.
Thank you for that. And we're now moving to Nicola Sturgeon.
Thanks, and I'll just repeat everybody else's thanks to those who've organised this. It's been a really important discussion. I don't think it's been comfortable for us, and I suspect we'll all go away feeling a bit chastened, and realising and recognising that we need to up our game even more. You've heard a lot tonight from all of us about what we think about the climate emergency, what we're going to do. We should all be held to account on what we actually do, not in the next decade, but this year, next year, and in the short term. It is urgent, and we have to not just say we recognise that, we've got to demonstrate that we understand and recognise that. So it's actions you need to judge all of us on. Scotland has the targets in place. Putting the targets in place is the easy bit for any country. It's what we now do to work our way systematically towards those. So it is about transport, it's about how we heat our homes, it's about protecting our land and our seas, it's about everything there that we need to do to meet the climate and the ecological crisis that we face, and you need to absolutely hold us to that. I agree with Patrick, and this will be my final point. I think this is a pivotal moment. COVID has disrupted everything, and when things fall apart, you get to choose how you put them back together, and we shouldn't put them back together the way they were before. This is a moment where we can do things differently. Everybody talks about an investment-led green recovery. I think we're all agreed on that. We have to deliver it, but tackling the inequalities that are endemic in our society, that has to be one of the other big things we do as we come out of this. So words are easy. It's our actions that you should judge us on and hold us to account on. But thank you to all of you for arranging this and inviting us here tonight.
Thank you, and thank you for being a part of this. And finally, Douglas Ross.
Thank you, and could I just reiterate the thanks to Cole, to Anna, to Dylan for moderating, for challenging us if we didn't answer the questions well enough, to everyone on chat who I think has told all the party leaders what they thought at respective points throughout this evening if they didn't feel we'd gone far enough, to Michaela, to thank you for what you've done, and to Lou and Robert for the sign language throughout tonight as well. Can I also say we've got an opportunity. In a few months' time, the eyes of the world are going to be on Scotland, are going to be on Glasgow, and young people are, I hope, going to play a big part in making Glasgow and COP26 a success. It can't just be 11 days in November when world leaders and officials from all across the globe come to Glasgow. We've got to see meaningful outcomes. And if we can deliver that as part of this UK conference, I think that will be a good grounding over the next few months to take forward this issue. But there is no doubt from every question, from every comment, from every point made tonight, we have an awful lot more to do. No party has a monopoly on the good ideas, but it looks like we have all let you down for too long. And I think we will all go away tonight remembering the passion, the interest and the enthusiasm you all have to correct this going forward, to ensure that your generation cannot be blamed in the same way our generation can be blamed for ignoring this issue for too long. So thank you for everything you've done tonight and for focusing our minds going forward over the next few weeks in the run up to the 6th of May, but beyond that in the next Parliament.
So we're out of time for this evening. Thank you to all of the young people who played a role in this evening, organising, submitting questions, my team of wonderful moderators who are back on the screen now, and of course, all of you watching at home. Thank you to all the leaders for answering our questions, and expect to see all the questions that we expect to see all the questions we didn't see answered in your inbox next week. The discussions will continue on #ScottHotSeat, and remember that you still have time to register to vote by Monday, the 19th of April, if you will be 16 or over on the 6th of May this year, and make sure that you go out and vote on the 6th of May and that you engage in all of these issues all year round. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, leaders.